Hi, folks, and welcome to this more unusual episode of Curiosities of Staffordshire. Unusual in the sense that it's the first time I've reappraised one of my earlier videos. My original video, entitled The Hamel Witch, Molly Lee, has had over 5,000 views, which I'm very grateful for, but I've noticed that the feedback's been mixed, with some feeling that I didn't really do justice to the story and to the lady behind the legend. To be honest, I agree with this assessment. My original video was done about 8 years ago, I think, on location at St John's Churchyard, in a bit of a rush between torrential rain showers, so I wasn't able to cover as much as I would have liked. Also, I admit at the time that, like many in Stoke-on-Trent, I'd been brought up on the folk tales of the Hamel Witch, and I wasn't very well acquainted with the historic figure that was Margaret Lee. Turns out that we know a lot more about the historic figure behind the tale than I realised at the time. In this episode, I'll aim to make amends, and we'll take a look at the historic Margaret Lee rather than the folk legend, which I hope you'll find equally as fascinating. Now, everyone in Stoke-on-Trent is probably familiar with the story of the Hamel Witch, but for those who aren't, and for those who haven't seen the original video, we'll have a quick recap. So the story goes that Margaret Lee, or Molly Lee, or even Peggy Lee, was a resident of Burslem in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, who lived a lonely existence on the rural outskirts of the town. Accounts typically describe her as having many of the stereotypical features of women who were labelled as witches. Ugly appearance, warts on the nose, vile temper, sharp tongue, etc., etc. She was known as an eccentric person who had a pet blackbird that often perched on her shoulder, and was often accused of selling watered-down milk at market. She came onto the radar of the local vicar, a Reverend Thomas Spencer, after she allegedly sent her bird to sour the beer of the Turk's Head pub, one of his favourite haunts. Although no charges were formally brought against Molly in her lifetime, after her death, various apparitions of her were allegedly seen around town, her restless ghost muttering, "Weight and measure sold I ever, milk and water sold I never." The Reverend Spencer was galvanised into action after apparently seeing Molly alive and well sat next to the fire in her cottage on his way home after one of his many visits to the pub. He gathered up the local clergy, exhumed her body from her grave, and had it reburied, along with the still living pet blackbird, in a north-south facing direction to contain her spirit and prevent it from ever returning. Even to this day, there are those who believe that dancing round her grave chanting, Molly Lee, chase me round the apple tree, or some other similar variation, will cause her spirit to return once more. So that's the story. I think you'll agree it's a decent ghost story, and one that scared many a young child over the ages. It's even inspired movies, theme park rides, and it's even inspired other witches over the ages to claim to be Molly Lee's descendants. But is any of it true? Well, the tomb's still there, as you can see in the photograph, and it's still facing in a contrary direction to the other gravestones in the churchyard, so the events of the story, at least concerning her burial, are almost certainly true. Her cottage also stood for many years in the area once known as Jackfield on present-day Hamel Road until the early 20th century, roughly where Port Vale's football ground is today. Here we see a black and white photo of the cottage while it was still standing, the apple tree in the garden perhaps inspiring the story about dancing round her grave. This map of Burslem from 1750, shortly after Molly's death, doesn't show the Jackfield estate where Molly lived, but I've just highlighted on here the rough direction of the estate in relation to St John's Church, where she's buried. The second map, taken in 1800, shows more clearly the location of Jackfields, just off the road that was then known as the Hamel, which now roughly follows the path of Hamel Road. And I've also highlighted the Turk's Head Inn in the middle of town, which is no longer there, by the way. In fact, it's just down the road from the Red Lion, which is these days more famously known as the place where Robbie Williams grew up. But we're digressing somewhat. As for the charges, well, you can find these in almost any playbook for accusing a witch in the 17th century. The fact that Molly Lee actually lived quite a long life, passing away in 1748 at the age of about 63, would suggest that she wasn't really persecuted in her lifetime, or at least any charges against her weren't taken seriously. In fact, she died long after the last witch in Britain was executed, I think it was 1720 something. In fact, when Margaret Lee passed away in 1748, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was in force, which meant that accusations of witchcraft couldn't be legally used in court. Witches weren't recognised as such in law, and anyone claiming to be a witch could be tried as a charlatan or a con artist. The Church of England also no longer officially persecuted witches. In fact, the Church often denounced the various other Christian denominations that still did, labelling them as rabble-rousers, stirring up primitive peasant superstitions. This doesn't mean to say that accusations didn't happen. Often in remote areas of the country, like Burslem still was in the pre-industrial era, witchcraft was alive and well in the public consciousness, although not always in a negative way. In the absence of a trained medical professional, your go-to person for treating your medical ailment would probably be the local cunning woman, which was often a byword for a witch. Indeed, in some versions of the story, Molly Lee is also described as being a cunning woman herself. It's likely then, in the case of Molly Lee, that the Reverend Spencer was acting alone, or with a small group of loyal followers, in pressing the issue of Molly's alleged witchcraft. Invariably, the Reverend is described in less than glowing terms himself, often portrayed as a drunk who neglected his duties. In some versions of the tale, he accuses Molly of bewitching him for being drunk for 3 whole weeks, a statement which you would hope would make even the poor, illiterate peasant folk of Burslem roll their eyes. But enough speculation. What do we actually know about the historical Molly Lee? The main source of information for her life comes from her last will and testament, which was written in 1748, perhaps days, if not hours, before she passed away. It's since been transcribed and a copy kept in the local newspaper archives since the 1980s. The will presents an interesting picture of a lady, the full name Margaret Lee, who was far from the lonely old crone depicted in the stories. The will mentions her ownership of several estates, both in Burslem and near Congleton, which provided her with a decent income. Although she died a spinster, the will mentions several family members, including her mother, who outlived her, and several cousins. Amongst the various instructions for distributing her income after her death, including gifting all of the income of her main Jackfield estate to her honoured mother, her inheritance included a £400 lump sum, to be divided equally amongst her cousin Anne's children. This adjusts with inflation to around £70,000 today, hardly the income of a society outcast who made a living selling tainted milk. While she had family who she clearly cared about deeply, she also made provision in her will for a dear friend named Alice Beach, to whom she left part of her estate known as the Wall Flat, where Alice had lived during Lee's lifetime. And she also provided an annuity for her and all of her descendants. One person excluding from her will, rather curiously, was her stepfather, and he was excluded in no uncertain terms from any inheritance. One can only speculate what the story was there, but they clearly didn't get along. Margaret provided for her family and friends, but a further demonstration of her generosity can be found in her provision for the local poor. She specified the provision for the purchase of 40 loaves of bread to be distributed to the poor, and on the passing of her remaining relatives for her lands to be given over to the building of a hospice to provide for the poor women of the parish, although there's no evidence that this wish was ever carried out. So, from the last will and testament of Molly Lee, we get a picture of a generous, kind-hearted, rather wealthy landowner who cared for the people of her parish. So how, then, do we get from this to the story of a bitter, lonely old witch who haunted the town? It's hard to say exactly, but her wealth no doubt had something to do with it. An independent lady with her own lands and income would no doubt have been looked at with envy by the local gentlemen, who may have found it incomprehensible how a woman was able to run a successful estate without a husband. Local historians such as Fred Hughes have also speculated that if Lee was really as ugly as the stories about her suggest, this may have contributed to the locals' disdain for her. In a time of superstition, people tended to shun people who had unconventional facial features or disformities. However, there's a lot of speculation here. We don't have an eyewitness account of Molly Lee's appearance, only the far-fetched accounts we hear in the stories, so there's no telling whether she actually was any more unusual in appearance than the average person. As I mentioned earlier, the accusations of Reverend Spencer don't appear to have caused Molly Lee any grief in her lifetime, given her ripe old age and wealth at the time of her death. She also had some notable associations with other local gentlemen, such as a Joseph Lovett of Penkle, who had a sizable estate of his own and was named as the executor of Lee's estate after her death. This would suggest that, rather being shunned by all in the local society, she was very much a part of it. As for the Reverend Spencer, it's been speculated that Lee might have just seen him for what he really was, a drunk and a poor example to the people of his parish, and she may have refused him when he requested funds for the upkeep of the church. If the picture of Spencer is accurate, I can't say as I'd blame her, and others in the parish probably felt the same way about him. So, there we have it. Margaret Lee, the woman and the myth. I'd argue that the success story of Lee as a landowner and a businesswoman in the patriarchal world of the 17th century is as fascinating as the well-known ghost story that became her lasting legacy. Hopefully future generations in Stoke-on-Trent will come to learn more about the real person behind the legend, and perhaps the future will be a bit more kind to her. It's also perhaps unfortunate that her lasting legacy is this falsified story of her as a witch, rather than the very generous hospice that she had planned for the people of Burslem that never apparently got built. As always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time for more Curiosities of Staffordshire.